Well, what do you say to an introduction that has already informed you I've cost myself at least 2 jobs? So the clue there is that relax and settle in. You're listening to somebody who is not the sharpest knife in the drawer that became to keep his own job. But friends, it is a pleasure to be here, and I want to add my voice along with all of you in terms of both congratulations and appreciation for Tom, and for Stephanie. We're told that this is the 10th anniversary. Where have you ever seen an organization start on day 1? This may be the 10th anniversary of the organization, but not of the dream. And so there were people who put a lot of effort into this that we're celebrating that goes beyond the years. Not only was this an organization, but it was a gathering of a cadre of leaders that are exceptional people who are really concerned about not the institution of the church, but the community of the church. Think about that cadre of leaders. Just look at the room that we have here tonight. These are people who paid attention and they reflected on their own work so that they could help others learn. So these are not insubstantial gifts by any means. And so we're here to acknowledge that, and believe me, I do really deeply feel the honor of being invited to this moment to talk, with a history such as this. I will say that there was a darker side to that for me. After all, a man of my age. Because part of the invitation was to say, would you bring a historical review or overview of conflict and so forth to help us reflect on that? And so, my birthday's coming up, and a man who thinks about age as much as I do, I thought, wait a minute, they think I'm old. And if not old, at least older than other people's memories about what happened with conflict. But there is a history to who we are and what we do. And in order to make sure that a banquet keynote does not turn into a breakfast conversation, I have notes. Now, I have been a full-time consultant for a full 25 years after my parish work. For 25 of those years, I have been focused on the issues of change. How do systems change? How do people change? Now I'm working with how do large systems go through deep change. But in those 25 years, for 20 years, I was directly involved with conflict. Let me invite you just very simply to reflect on the language that I had to learn. Because when I started out, we didn't talk about conflict, we talked only about church fights. But after we began to talk about church fights, we went on to talk about conflict resolution. And part of my training was in conflict resolution. Do you hear what just happened there? We thought we could solve these. Until we learned more about it, and conflict resolution turned into conflict management. Can't solve them, but let's at least keep them, And then we began to learn about conflict mediation. And now we're beginning to use the language of conflict transformation. Do you hear the progression? When I was a younger man and I had hair, this is the same theme here, Susan, they used to talk about justice. And justice was people who wanted to talk about fairness, and if not fairness, at least what they thought was fair. And the language has matured. We talk now about retributive justice, and this is part of the gift of JustPeace to help kind of portion some of these things out. But retributive justice, the adversarial nature of the law, which has a good side to it as well, but it also carries with it the assumption that you and I cannot continue to manage our relationship, and so we will now fight over the spoils. And it assumes that community can be broken. But then after we moved past the retributive justice, we began to talk about restorative justice, and this truly is where JustPeace is really making a claim. And we begin to talk about the relational nature of the law, where we can assume that our relationship can continue despite the difficulty of our conversations. Do you hear the different assumption? But that it takes trust, it takes forgiveness, and it takes responsibility. What we're beginning to say in all of that is that as we begin to work with these issues of community, and I will come back to that any number of times here tonight, that what we're really talking about is community and Christian community, that we have been in a process of maturing. We have been in a process of growing. And I really do want us to pay attention to the language, because the language is what we use to talk ourselves into learning. I really am appreciative of Tom Long's book on testimony. Tom says that we give words to our experience because that's how we talk our way into faith. He doesn't really say that what we do is we figure out what we believe so that we can announce it. What he says is that we begin to give testimony to our faith so that we can live it. This is also Wesleyan in his encounter with the Moravians. You preach faith until you have it. Well, in this case, what we're doing is we're preaching community until we learn it. Our language is helping us find our way in. The path of language that we've been traveling is trying to talk our way into God's community. Now, I was with, and shortly before today, many of you were aware of Tom's new book. Today, if you weren't, it was shared with us again. Language. Tom's new book, The Spirit and Art of Conflict Transformation. Do you hear where we are? The Spirit and Art of Conflict Transformation, creating a culture of just peace. We're not solving problems anymore. We're not trying to find out who's right and wrong. What we're asking is that people live into a new culture that has something to do with reflecting God's kingdom. Do you hear the difference? And the one thing I would want to point out is that I did find the book as good as the title. Okay, so if that's of any help, thanks very much. Okay, so, we have been on this path together, and so, it would be natural at a time like this to say, okay, if that's what we've been doing, if this has been a path of learning, what did we learn? And so, here we go. I'm going to share a very short list of some things I've learned. What I do know is when I start a list like this, the people in this room can add to it immeasurably. What have I learned? Well, the first thing I learned is that people need better things to argue about. Literally. Bishop Jung, not mentioning any conferences. I had a conversation with an older gentleman who, in the middle of a rather difficult church conflict, wanted to know, why anyway do we have to sing more than one of the 20 approved hymns? This is a man, seriously, who needed more things to argue about. I think about one of our large congregations where on the very first day that the new pastor preached the sermon, he walked down the central aisle and he followed the choir out. And it was on that day that he began the ending of his ministry. Because his predecessor was a remarkably good preacher who was a humble man who informed everybody regularly out of his humility, I don't know if you hear the tongue-in-cheek here, that he would never walk down the central aisle because that would draw too much attention to the preacher in the sermon, and it's not about me, it's about God. Do you hear the song? No one told his successor. And this was a congregation that had had its sense of humor surgically removed. And that man at the end of his first worship service was at the beginning of the end of his ministry. This is stuff that, well, okay.